Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening.
Okay, Liv, Patrick and I, we are so excited to have you on today. This topic around eating disorders, anorexia, ARFID has been coming up a lot in the neurodivergent space, which I'm so thankful that we're finally getting some good awareness around this. So I guess I'll share a little bit of context for how I know you, and then I'll let you introduce yourself if there's key context or identities I've missed. So you and I think we followed each other's work for a while on Instagram, and then you reached out when your book Rainbow Girl came out. And I finally got around to reading it once you released the Audible version. And I am so grateful that you've put this out in the world. We had Tiffy Hammond on a few months back, who talks a lot about the power of storytelling as advocacy. And I really, when I was reading your book, that I learned so much, but it wasn't like an education guide. Like, you weren't setting out to let me educate you about all these things. You were sharing your story of being an undiagnosed autistic person navigating misattuned eating disorder treatments. I really wish every mental health provider would read your book, because I think these things do get misunderstood so frequently. So first of all, just thank you for putting your story out there. Thank you for being here. I guess that wasn't much of an intro. Are there other core identities or parts of who you are that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for those incredibly kind words. I mean, the power of storytelling, that's part of, why I wrote my book, because, as humans for generations, that is how we pass down information, is through stories. And especially through stories that have complex problems. Because I always talk with my clients about, they talk about the shame and the blame almost that comes from having had trauma, growing up and having faced all these hardships and saying what did I do to deserve this, blah, blah, blah. But I talk about how it's, the stories and the traumas and the difficulties that we face that mold us into who we are. And I often give the example of, I could say that a guy wakes up in the morning, makes his coffee, reads a book, spends the whole day walking outside and then going to bed. And then I say, technically that's a story, but it's not a story anyone would want to read, because I'm like, where's the problem? Where's the grenade that falls on his house and he needs to escape from, So yeah, kind of coming back to my story and Rainbow Girl and eating disorders and autism, growing up, I always knew I was different. And in a way, the eating disorder was a way for me to hold on to something tangible, something that I knew I could always trust and rely on in a world that felt utterly untrustworthy and unreliable. And there were these rules that I didn't know, people my age, the other girls in my class, they were so different from me, and I've always identified as a girl, she, her pronouns, but I didn't like playing with dolls. I didn't like imitating the doll voices, as I talk about in my book. I didn't like gossiping. It felt very immoral and incorrect to talk about people behind their back, but that was seemingly, what you did at that age. So anyways, when I was 11, 12, we started learning about health and nutrition in school. And it was like this existential purpose just landed in my lap, because I was like, I don't know why I'm here. I was always asking those, what's the purpose of life questions ever since I was little. And when we started learning about health and nutrition, my literal autistic mind latched onto that of if I'm this perfect healthy eater, then I'm doing life, quote unquote, correct. I can't be wrong. I can't be wrong in this world. I can't be broken. I won't need to be fixed if, I make sure that I do this thing so well. And for me, that quickly spiraled into, weight loss, obviously, falling off the growth curve, being diagnosed with anorexia and depression shortly thereafter. Um, and that the diagnosis just always, and still does, it was never the correct diagnosis, in my opinion. And then people
Can
often
I
ask, yeah, go ahead.
can I pause you to I kind of want to dig a well in this topic we're
Yeah.
in right now, and then
Yeah, I love it.
I'm totally disrupting your flow, but
No, I love
there's
it. I
so
love
much
it.
here, 'cause this was the part of the book that I had some aha moments, was around when you learned in health class, these are good foods and these are bad foods.
Yeah.
And then you talk a lot about Ensure, because they kept trying to get you to drink
Yeah.
Ensure, and you would read the ingredients. You'd be like, no, there's corn syrup in here. I am
Right.
not drinking that. And how that was so misunderstood. It
Yeah.
was seen as like you not wanting calories versus like, no, this is
Right.
a bad food. And I
Yeah.
think, and this, you highlight that so well, how it was about having something with certainty of
Yeah.
like, this means I'm good. And I get that feedback loop of I'm making good choices. I am good. For
Yeah.
me, so also like socialized as girl, I do identify more gender expansively, a gender. But social communication and girls was so confusing to me.
Yeah.
For me, it was religion. That was my I learned the rules, and if
Mhm.
I could follow strictly, I had a feedback loop of I am good, I am okay. And so I
Yeah.
just think this, looking for some sort of system, whether it's
Yes.
good, bad food, religion, I think a lot of us fall into this, and it
Mhm.
gets so misunderstood if we don't see the autism.
Right. It's looking for the how to because we don't know how to. But then it's of course, does anyone really know how to in this world? But I'm not gonna go into that rabbit hole. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. I read your book recently, listened to the audio version. But obviously it's more of like a self-help. I didn't know that about you and the religion. I'd love to talk about that on my podcast in the future.
Okay. Yes, we can talk about that. Patrick, did you have any system in adolescence that was your feedback loop of I'm a decent human if I do follow these rules?
I don't remember having a specific system for am I a decent human, but I'm thinking specifically, and this is a complete divergent thought of how similar eating disorders and addictions are, and how that compulsion and that obsession and how you kind of center your entire life and experience around
Yeah.
that existence. It brings up a lot of my gambling addiction and the experiences that come alongside that too. So
Oh, totally. I'm so glad you mentioned that because I believe, especially with Megan, your term feedback loop, it's like constantly. And then if you add ADHD and like dopamine into that, it's like chasing the next high, but then you need more high every time again. There's this, phrase in the eating disorder space. If you give the eating disorder an inch, it'll take a mile. And it'll like keep taking more miles. And I feel like that's the same with like every addiction is like, no pun intended, you get a taste of what it feels like to, restrict and be praised for being so disciplined. I remember, going for runs as an 11-year-old and I would just be miles, not miles, obviously, not literally. But I would be running ahead of my parents and there would be like people walking dogs being like, wow, she's so disciplined. And, for me, I was like, oh, like I need to go faster. I need to keep doing this. So I like secretly started training and like wanted to run a marathon at some point. And it was just this feeling like, again, this euphoria of this is this one thing I know I can be good at. And something about eating disorders that not a lot of people talk about, but I know that the feeling superior is like a common autistic trait. That also I feel like isn't talked about a lot, but like when you have an eating disorder and when you like make food for other people and like watch them eat it and you have like no remorse and you are like, oh, like I'm so disciplined, like I'm not going to eat that. You feel so much better than everyone else because you feel superior. And that high almost, that sensation of I am so much better than everyone else is a huge part of the reason I think why it's so hard to let go, not of the eating disorder, but to let go of the identity of an eating disorder. Because when you identify as someone who has purpose and feels better and feels higher almost in some way, like, why would you ever let that go to be normal kind of thing? But of course, there's a lot of nuances to that.
I love that. I love that you're tapping into this identity piece. I was even thinking about that when you're talking about the runner, like that becomes an
Yeah,
identity. And
totally.
especially those of us like who mask, right? One of the downsides of that is a diffuse social identity. So I think a lot of us are looking for our identity. I noticed until I discovered I was autistic, I was always looking to locate my identity through outside things. So like when I became a vegan, I was a really intense vegan and it was a
I
huge
didn't know
part of
that.
my identity. Yeah, in my 20s I was a vegan and it was and it was so hard to release it because it was like, no, this is my identity. Same thing with
Right.
religion. Like I was this like hyper religious but like it was a hard part of my identity to release. And it's partly because I had so much self-consciousness
Mhm.
about myself that I needed to find an external identity.
Yeah.
But that superiority, that's really interesting because I think a lot of us socially, I always feel really inferior. And
Mhm.
so I've also, like, whether it's through academia or these other sources, looked for things that will give me a footing of feeling superior. And I don't like that about myself, but like, if I'm being
Yeah.
honest, it's absolutely there. It's still there.
Oh, I think we all have that.
So
It's just some
yeah.
capacity.
Yeah. And I appreciate you naming it. It's not like the most comfortable thing to name of like, it feels
Right.
good to feel superior.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. And I think it's important to talk about because, it's taboo and that's why people don't talk about it. But I think it is so important to name that because I want people listening to this who feel that at times to not feel like they're a bad person for thinking that.
I think it's a really normal psychological defense. Whenever I'm talking with someone and it gets awkward, and it's like, I mean, you all listen to the podcast, it's usually my fault. Then I will start in my head listing my accomplishments, like, oh, well, I run a business, and
Yeah.
I'm protecting my ego, and it's
Yes.
shitty. Like because I'm trying to equalize the playing field because I'm feeling
Yeah.
like right now in this moment, I feel really incompetent socially. So in my
Yes.
head, if I can boost myself up, then it like gives me some
Yeah.
protection or some psychological defense.
Oh,
So yeah, I imagine this is a defense that comes up for a lot of us, and it is really uncomfortable to talk about. Thank you.
well,
yeah, I
thank
think
you
it's
too.
important to
Yeah.
talk about. But if we think about this experience of being autistic and not knowing, especially as a child or a teenager,
Mhm.
which a lot of us who have been diagnosed later in life, we didn't know this about ourselves. We
Yeah.
knew what you said, Liv. I felt different. I felt like I didn't belong. I felt like I couldn't connect. We hear these things all the time. I felt like I just never fully arrived. I didn't know how to people. I didn't know how to actually experience ABC. We're always going to try to look for that footing then to say, like, how can I propel myself forward to ensure that I feel like I can have a place where I find my footing or anchor
Right.
into? And I think that makes a lot of sense. And then circling back to eating disorders and addiction, we're talking about control. We're talking about rigidity. We're talking about a lot of the things that feel comfortable for us, right? Like our
Right.
systems are craving that stuff. And it makes a lot of sense why we default into these, I'm trying to think of my wording, mechanisms that really
Unhelpful
just don't.
coping.
That's what I was looking for. I was trying to rack my
I
brain for
liked
what we used to
mechanisms
ask,
too,
but
though. I was like, that's such an adaptive brain wound production there.
and it makes sense why we are seeking that out because, again, it's like if we can have that control, that rigidity, and that structure, and that place of feeling like, okay, I know that in the confines of this, I exist in this, and I can control this environment. It makes life a hell of a lot more manageable and a lot more comfortable in those moments.
Yes. Yeah, that word the confines, I often use the word constraints. I know, and I say, like, when we create a box, we know that as long as we're in that box and we stay within the boundaries of that box, we are safe. And that word safety is such an important word because, I mean, that's what human survival revolves around, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's kind of a through line in your story was you were seeking safety. And I think the way family and healthcare providers saw your resistance to eating disorder interventions was as resistance,
Yeah.
and it got really misinterpreted. The behaviors you were doing, which were seeking safety, were getting misinterpreted as resistance to
Yeah.
treatment.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah. And I think demand avoidance definitely played into that as well. And just this
I
like,
was curious about that because I heard a lot of that. Like
yeah, my
when you would
autonomy.
be, yeah, when you'd like secretly be exercising, I
Yeah.
was like, okay, is that a demand avoidant thing? Because that, yeah.
Totally.
So can you say more about
Totally.
that?
Yeah, with the secret exercise, I mean, when I think back to certain things now, I just like I cannot help just but laugh because I'm like, I would like I think I talk about this in the book, but I would like stretch out like I would pretend I was taking a shower. I would like turn the shower on so that they couldn't hear my like deep breathing, and then I would like put all my like my hands and my feet like in the corners of like the bathtub and just do push-ups because so that they couldn't look under the door and like see me doing push-ups because I actually got caught
Mm.
once doing push-ups in the bathroom and they like saw the shadows under the door or something. So I was like, okay, I need to come up with something else. And I would do that and I would, do planks while I was pretending to be sleeping. And in the middle of the night, I would get up and do sit-ups and do burpees and jumping jacks and all this secret exercise. And I hated it. It wasn't that I felt like I need to do this to burn off what we had for dinner or I need to compensate. It was just I was not allowed to exercise. So I was like, you're going to tell me I'm not allowed? Well, that's like, I'm going to show you. I'm going to prove to you, even though they didn't know, it was more proving to myself, I'm going to
Mhm.
prove to myself that I have autonomy, that no one can take my choices away from me. So I think in that
Mm.
sense, the lack of awareness around neurodiversity and eating disorders, specifically with the demand avoidance component. I mean, you as a clinician or as a professional or provider can be inflicting so much harm on an individual and their ability to heal from an eating disorder by not understanding that stripping their autonomy away from them is not going to help them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I think about especially interventions for anorexia, and particularly when there's the level of hospitalization, I mean,
Yeah.
there is so much loss of autonomy.
Oh my God, like the I know so many people that, have been held down, bound down to beds, tubes
Mhm.
stuffed down their throat. It's actually in Holland, there was this one girl who was actually tied to a bed for over 3 years, I believe. And they wouldn't, because she was suicidal and she said, as soon as you release me, basically I'm gonna kill myself. And I'm just thinking, like, of course you're gonna kill yourself if you're tied down to a bed for 3 years with tube fed, like with no no sense of choice. So yeah, I don't know about in the US. I feel like because the Netherlands is very small, and I just know that a lot of the patients I was in treatment with there ended up like having these traumatic force feed experiences. So that's kind of why I know about it. But there in Holland there was a lot of like like legal like jurisdictional, I don't know the terminology here,
Mhm.
but that if that even like the children get like taken away from the parents because the parent is not forcing them into treatment. So then the jury or the judge can decide, like, this whole family is incompetent, basically. We're going to let the psychiatrist or the hospitals, like, take guardianship over this kid,
Mm.
which ends up, causing them to be force fed and tied to bed. This ridiculous stuff that only causes more trauma. And the more trauma, the more likely they are to cling tighter to the eating disorder. Like, it's just, it doesn't make any sense, but because no one knows what to do, it's like, as long as we keep them alive. But I'm like, there's a difference between being alive and surviving, like, at the hands of someone else's coercion, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, and I want to be mindful that I'm not like, I have a question I want to ask. And as I'm sitting with this, I'm like, is this me trying to move away from the discomfort of everything you just named? Because everything you just named is really hard to
We
take
can,
in
though.
and
We
really
can, though.
disturbing. Um, well, no, I'm naming, naming the complexity that I'm sitting with. And because I do think it's important to hold space for just how traumatizing a lot of the interventions and the systems are, especially for autistic people. But the question I had was, you did eventually find a place that supported you and supported your autonomy, where you were able to, I don't know, is recover, is that a word? Is that how you would describe it, or heal, or?
It's interesting because I actually was on a recent eating disorder call where we talked about the word yeah, I heard that too. It sounds like a bird in a cage or something. Oh, I thought it was like a parrot. Okay, I'm sorry. So sorry. What were we talking about? I completely lost my
I think I was asking about, I was asking about your terminology of recovering or healing, but you could also just start talking about the house. I want to call it a house. I know that's not the name of it.
No, it is called Carolina House, but I think it's important. I think it actually is important because you said you did find a place that respected your autonomy. No. I probably did a bad job illustrating that in the book, in retrospect, because it kind of seems like that was like the thing that saved me. But looking back, that treatment center was no different than any of the previous treatment centers I had been in. The difference was me willingly saying, I'm surrendering, you can give me foods I don't like, you can do this, you can do that. I know it's going to be so hard, but this time I'm not going to fight back. This time I'm going to let you basically save me, which in essence was, I'm going to allow you to guide me to save myself. But if I would have been,
it was your choice.
Yeah. And that was the key difference, because if I was placed there, without wanting to, it would have been the same thing as every other place. And looking back, I didn't know I was autistic at the time still, so there were a lot of things that still kind of haunt me today that I need to go into therapy about trauma that I actually endured while in that treatment. Invalidation, calling autistic traits OCD behaviors. When I said when I needed to microwave my food because it needed to be the Goldilocks temperature, it was, you're just trying to delay eating, your eating disorders in the room with us, just this gaslighting basically. So, but I honestly don't know how I did it, thinking back now and kind of bringing back those memories, but I was so determined to get better from my eating disorder and to stop being a slave to the addiction, that I was like, you can gaslight me all you want. I didn't know the term at the time, obviously. You can invalidate me all you want, but that's not going to stop me. And I think that discipline and willpower and just perseverance was my autistic self emerging. Because I think in part, the reason why I was able to sustain an eating disorder for so long was because I was like, I have decided to do this. And I think, as you both know, when we decide to do something, we have decided we are not going to stop until we've achieved whatever we want to achieve. And when it came to recovery or healing, or I actually prefer the term discovery, because I think more than recovering from an eating disorder, the journey is about discovering who you really are. And for me, part of that was, discovering I'm autistic. The moment I decided, I'm committed to getting better, I'm committed to discovering who I am without the mask of an eating disorder, I was like, I'm going to stop at nothing until I found freedom. So I think that kind of answers what was a question.
Yeah.
Introduction.
It was a big question. At what point in your journey, in your process, did you discover your autism?
Actually, through my first coaching client. So I thought, when I was perceived to be recovered, from my eating disorder, again, it's just such an abstract term because everyone defines being recovered differently. But I believed, I'm free. I wasn't engaging in what were labeled as eating disorder behaviors anymore, but I still had some things around food that I still have because these are autistic traits, completely unrelated to the eating disorder. But they were things that I knew inherently in my heart, like I know these aren't related to an eating disorder because I have been this way since I was a little kid. So I was like, I'm recovered, and I wanted to help other people specifically who, had been tossed out of treatment like I was, been told you're manipulative, you're too complex, you're hopeless, you're just gonna have to manage this forever kind of thing. And at this time I had a blog and I was on Instagram and sharing my story, and I knew that a lot of people were wanted help actually from me. Like people had been messaging me like, "Can I talk to you?" And I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna make something out of this," because I knew I couldn't do the typical school path. Like, no way. So I was like, I'm gonna launch my own coaching business. And my very first client was autistic, and she was telling me how she resonated with this like too complex label because she was autistic and had anorexia, and all the professionals basically said like, yeah, like we cannot disentangle this, so like you have to fix your autism first before you can fix your eating disorder. And like it kind of went that way of like seeing actually in the Netherlands, saying someone is autistic is actually like an insult. So, but that's a side tangent. Um, but she was basically telling me about her like eating disorder and her childhood and growing up. And I was like, whoa, like this is me. Like you were telling me
Mm.
me. And so obviously I was like, I need to learn more about autism. So I like read all the books, and specifically the book 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘀𝘁 by 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘀𝘁. I mean, I read the first page of that book, and I think I read the entire book in like a few hours in one afternoon. And in that moment, I was like, I know I'm autistic, and no one can tell me otherwise. And the rest is kind of history. But ever since learning about that, I was able to, upon reflection, see how all these autistic traits. Buddhi Simone has a great graph in their book. I was like, if you mix this with food and exercise, you literally have created the ultimate recipe for an eating disorder. So it all made sense to me. And then as I started sharing more about the intersection and my specific relationship with how autism manifests as an eating disorder, more and more feedback, more and more resonance. And I was like, I have hit on something here that is huge. And I'm so grateful that I leaned into that hunch, because now, like, being able to help so many autistic people, and people who even come to me who are now all end up being diagnosed autistic, I'm like, this is my true purpose in life. And it's so fulfilling.
Mm.
Love that. That's a great share right there. And it's amazing when you have that epiphany moment, because I think we are all searching for that epiphany moment so often. But I'm really glad that you make something that I want to circle back to, which
Mhm.
is the too complex or highly complex cases, because this happens in the addiction field as well,
Yeah.
where we would try to make referral after referral for someone who was autistic, who also maybe was struggling with substance use or alcohol or whatever. And we were constantly rejected for referrals because too complex, can't disentangle. I like that word that you just used. The inability to really show up and treat both at the same time,
Yeah.
or the lack of knowledge of just co-occurring, or the lack of knowledge of autism in general. So it just further complicates someone who really wants that support and that help. And circling back even further to you saying, I just had this moment where I was like, I'm going to surrender to this. That
Yeah.
is kind of how my gambling addiction went. Like 10 years of just pure hell. And then one day I was just like, wave
Yeah.
the white flag. Like I have to. And like you said, once my brain was committed to really figuring that part of my life out, I was so committed. And I thank my
Yeah.
autistic self for that, because I think otherwise it would have, I don't really know where that would have gone, honestly.
Yeah, I love that you say like you thank your autistic self, because kind of circles back to what I was saying. I think it was my autistic perseverance and like a commitment to whatever it was that allowed me to be like, I'm stopping at nothing until I'm free from this.
Mhm.
So Megan, I'm curious if you have any kind of similar experience.
Yeah, I do, and I've been sitting on it, and I'm like, do I share this? So I started self harming. I started cutting when I was 13 or 14, and it was
Mhm.
a pretty significant addiction. And I was going once my parents discovered how bad it was. I was already in therapy, but they bumped up to like twice weekly therapy, and there was at times talk of inpatient that was more due to suicidality. Um, but yeah, my mental health was really bad, and a lot of the ways that came out was through um, cutting. And at one point, again, once they realized how significant it was, they started doing body checks, and I started getting really clever, and it was that same autonomy thing.
Yeah.
But that I did reach a point, and it's interesting. Like I don't know that this would be considered neurodivergent affirming, but I actually am really glad my parents made this decision. They said you cannot get your license to drive
Mhm.
until this gets under control.
Mhm.
And that was my surrender moment of like, okay. But I did have to choose because I was doing a lot of
Yes.
sneaky self-harming. But at some point, faced with that decision, that was my moment of surrender. And so I'm really resonating with this idea of there being a surrender moment. And it didn't mean that I like never relapsed after that, but it
Oh
did
yeah,
mean
of
that
course.
I was finally like, okay, I will I will actually like try to stop this behavior. Um so yeah, I am very much relating to the surrender piece.
Yeah, and what you said about, your parents, they still gave you a decision. They said like you can either go get your license or you can continue on this path. And so for you it was still like, okay, I get to choose. It wasn't like, we're putting you in a ward right now, like so that you can't do this. So I think having that autonomy in some sense, because it's important to mention that the time by the time that I decided, like I'm gonna surrender to this, my whole family was like, Livia, we can't save you. Like we're gonna support you. We're gonna support you in whatever way we can. We're gonna show you unconditional love, but we're not going to force you into anything anymore. Like we surrender. We surrendered to you. Basically, was my parents' attitude. And when I finally felt that, when I was like, oh my god, like I finally like I can choose now. That's when I did choose.
Mm. Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
fascinating to me because that's almost verbatim like my experience as well. Like with
Yeah.
my dad enabling. And then finally he was just like, I can't save you from yourself. Like you're gonna have to make this decision. And
Yeah.
it's weird how these like light bulb moments come up for us when we're doing such destructive behaviors to ourselves. And I don't know about you, Livy, but for me, I knew how damaging this was the entire time. Like gambling was unbelievably destructive. I knew this. And I think that's what makes it even harder because emotionally you're just shaming the shit out of yourself during it because you're like, I can see how much destruction I'm causing
Yeah.
and I cannot stop.
Yeah. Oh my god. Totally, totally, totally. And I think that's why I didn't never resonated with that like stereotypical like, oh, someone who has anorexia looks in the mirror and sees themselves as fat. Cause I would look in the mirror and I would be like, oh my god, like I'm looking at a skeleton. Like and I know that like a lot of times that's a huge stigma around eating disorders is that like you have to be skeletal to have an eating disorder, which is totally not true. Like you can have an eating disorder any size or weight or shape. But like I knew like that I looked like a corpse basically. Like people whenever I went outside I was afraid to go outside because I knew that people would like stare me up and down and I knew that, like, what I was doing was, like this is probably not the right language, like, it was crazy, like and, like, I knew, like, I am killing myself, like, right now, like, I'm destructing myself, yet the control that I feel from this outweighs any kind of perception of how damaging it is. It's all, again, that comes back to that ego piece of, like, I know that what I'm doing is wrong and damaging, but right now it's more important to me that I maintain this identity of who I've shaped myself to be. Because if I let go of this identity, well, then what's left of me? Like, well, then who am I? And that's perhaps like the most challenging question of like human of the human mind is like, who am I without external identities?
Mhm. I feel like you captured, like, I have the feeling right now. Like, I feel like you captured the trapped feeling so well of like
Yeah.
when I'm stuck in loops that I know are so destructive to me, but I also feel so pulled by the compulsions. And it's, yeah, I just feel trapped because it's
Yeah.
like not able to release this thing that you know is causing harm. And it's,
Yeah.
I think that gets back to like how this is such a lot of these behaviors originate from this drive for safety. And so even though we rationally know this is very unsafe for me, it is so hard to
Yeah. No,
release
that
some of these
the
loops.
trapped word is so accurate too. Also, just in the context of, fight or flight mode, is that for me, as a very anxiety prone person, I'm always in fight or flight mode. And if it's not that, I'm in shutdown mode. Um, and in a sense, like the eating disorder and the compulsive exercise also, along with the autonomy piece, it was a way for me to release this like mobilized energy that was constantly building up inside of me, and that building up was honestly heightened by the taking away the autonomy. I was so mad. I was so angry. I was like, "How can you be doing this to me? Don't you see that the treatment is not helping?" And I think being autistic in or neurodivergent, especially with the ADHD component, in a world that tries to contain us and basically play small, like don't do anything crazy, don't do anything outside of the box, like just conform, just be like everyone else. It it makes us have more of that fight or flight sympathetic energy, basically, and wanting to basically escape and like tap into who you know you can be, which is so much greater almost than the physical body. I like, it sounds weird, but like knowing of all the things you can contribute to society and do, and then feeling like you are trapped in this body, that can be that can be so almost unbearable to deal with. And I think if you add like gender dysphoria into that, because like there's a lot of overlap, as we know, between neurodiversity, eating disorders, and the LGBTQIA plus community, or I don't know if there's more letters now. Um, but that gender spectrum, when that plays into it, and you feel like you aren't in a body that like belongs to you either, like I guess, yeah, that what I'm trying to say is that that trapped feeling, like if anyone listening is feeling that, like know that you are not alone. Cause I think all of us to some extent do feel trapped in this like physical thing we call our bodies. But what has really helped me almost accept being in this body is the idea that like our bodies are not actually our possessions. And what I mean by that is like if I planted an apple tree in my backyard, like it would be on quote unquote my property, but it wouldn't actually be my tree. It would be the tree of the planet, and it like makes up the planet's matter. And that's kind of how I see our bodies. Like just like an ecosystem has all these different elements that like work together. Like we work together with the trees, right? Because they give us oxygen, um and like when we excrete what urine, it goes back into the ground and provides things, and flies eat our excretions, right? Like, so in that sense, that has really helped me and a lot of my clients like accept, especially with like body dysmorphia, that like just seeing the body is not something that is like ours and that needs to be controlled, but more something that is just in like an organic part of the planet and the world. And I know I kind of went off on a tangent here, but I felt like
But
that was
this
like
is
a natural path to go down.
this is interesting. Yeah, no, and like an ecological view of the body and how that
Yeah.
could be empowering. I'm actually really like I've not had that idea before, and I'm really drawn to this idea. So
Yeah.
in self-care for autistic people, one thing I say, and people often when they reach out, they're like, this line resonated so much.
Uh-huh.
I say, I think it's like in the intro, the hardest part about being autistic for me is not the social communication
Yes.
stuff. It's my relationship to my body.
Yes.
And I think that unless you have a deep understanding of autism, like people just miss that.
Yeah.
So this idea of seeing the body from an ecological, interconnected framework versus a possessive framework is so deeply interesting to me.
I'm so glad to hear that. And yeah, coming back to your book, I remember when I just started listening and I heard you say that the hardest part is being in my body. I was like, yes, yes, yes.
Mhm. Yeah, I talk to so many people where it's like, why? Why do we have these bodies? Why do we have these things that require maintenance and work and that are hard to be in?
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
yep.
even like this morning, I was like, I woke up and I was like, oh God, I need to wash my hair. No. Yeah.
You look contemplative, Patrick. I can't tell if that is a
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what we're talking about. I mean, I often feel so like I've said this many times on this podcast that I feel like it's so often torturous to be inside of my body, and how difficult it is to communicate that to other people who don't get it. So I'm just
Yeah.
thinking about the fact that all three of us are sitting here like, yeah, this is a universal truth that the three of us know to be true, that it is just so challenging and uncomfortable. And so I like the reframe different perspectives on this too.
Yeah, and it actually reminded me of I think it was the first episode of your not the first episode of your podcast, but the first one I listened to where you two were talking about sleep. And I don't know which one of you it was because this was like a while ago. How one of you said like, oh, like for me to sleep throughout the night is like the most rare occurrence ever. And I that sense of like feeling trapped in my body is honestly most prominent like when I am trying to go to sleep and I can't. And I'm like, why can't you just let me rest? And it's so frustrating because it's in those moments that I like want to like dream and I want to like mentally transcend into like an alternate reality, but I can't because I'm here in this body that won't do what I want it to do.
Yeah.
I'm here in this body that won't do what I want it to do. Yeah. Yeah.
Vibes.
Yeah. 0 out of 10 would not recommend it. No, I get that so much. Like just at night where you're just so aware of that discomfort, that just complete and utter need to shut down and fall asleep. And you're so exhausted mentally and physically, and it just won't, it doesn't happen. And you're just, you
Yeah.
become even more aware of how uncomfortable you are in all of the different ways. So it's a nightly occurrence.
Yeah. Yeah, well, even daily, right? Like, how often do any of you guys like try to sit down in a chair and be like, nope, that's not a comfortable position, getting up, sitting somewhere else? No, not comfortable. Like,
Oh
it's
my
so,
gosh. Yes. Like
it's so,
I call it the Goldilocks of stimulus. You said Goldilocks earlier of like, and it's
yeah,
like, or getting dressed. It's like, nope, that doesn't feel right today. Nope, this doesn't. And like, it's just, oh, it's so fussy to find the ideal Goldilocks of like, just right.
yeah, yeah. I actually, the other day, because I need new glasses, and I went to the store to get new glasses, and the woman that like greeted me, like, she had like bright orange hair, and I got this like vibe from her. I was like 99% she's autistic, but I didn't want to say anything. So I just like started talking to her, and we were talking about the glasses, and like obviously me, there were like these two pairs that I was like, yep, I don't like that one and I don't like that one. Do you have like an in between? And she goes, oh, the Goldilocks problem. And I was like, I love that you said Goldilocks because I always talk about that in like terms of autism and needing to get things just right, like hinting like, yeah, I'm autistic. And she goes, oh my gosh, me too. And I was like, yeah, I've known that for like the past 20 minutes. And it was so funny because I think, you know, like when you discover this about yourself and you just start seeing it in other people too that you meet, it just like bonds you in a way that like you can't describe. And like you just form these connections that that I really have been able to form with non-autistic or non-neurodivergent people. And I think, yeah, just think it's so unique. And another reason why I do see being neurodivergent as a gift is that it's a way for you to connect with other humans on like a deeper level. Because Patrick, to like use your phrasing, you just get each other. Like there's no other way than to say it. Like you just get each other. Like there's no words even necessary.
Which is such a rare experience for us because most of us
Yeah.
have been navigating like the spaces we're in, we're a neurominority in the spaces we're in. So all of a sudden to be with people where it's like it clicks,
Yeah.
it's such a powerful feeling. And that to me has been such a gift of discovery of the last 3 years, is finding connections and community where our communication, like it's because it's a culture, right? Like we just
Yeah.
click and connect in the way even the way we show empathy through story swapping, like none of us
Yeah.
are like, oh my gosh, you're making it about you, because we get it. Like,
Right.
yeah, it's just it's so expansive and freeing to not feel like you have to explain yourself every step of the way, and just to let connections flow.
Right. Right. Exactly.
A lot of my friends are not happy with my gift of acknowledging and understanding when they are autistic a year before they are ready to know that they are autistic. But that's come up a lot recently, where
Nice.
I've been like, they're like, you knew this a year ago? It's like, yes, I've known this the entire time, but you are not ready to hear that. So here we are. But
Yeah, I
I'm
call it
gonna,
in my book. I call it the autistic sixth sense.
yeah, feels that
Mhm.
way for sure. It feels that way for sure. I'm going to be the one to wrangle us back in today. And because I know a lot of our listeners want to listen to both of you really talk about ARFID and the 3 different types. And I'm just curious if we want to diverge there or where we want to go.
Yeah, sure. Megan, do you have time?
Yeah, I've got like 15 minutes here. So yeah, I've got time. Do you want to
Okay.
take this question on ARFID? Oh, first of all, forgive me if you talk about this in the book, but I'm assuming you also had ARFID or have ARFID. Do you have ARFID?
No, well, that's kind of, yeah, where the semantics and the whole label flea comes in, is because I don't believe that I had an eating disorder that is even in the DSM or that is even diagnosable at this point in time. So my actually next book that I plan on writing is going to be basically about a proposed model of eating adaptations, as I like to call them. Basically how eating disorders manifest differently in autistic people, and why we can't ever box or label them as ARFID or anorexia or any of what's currently existing in the DSM.
Yeah.
Because I still don't resonate with anorexia, don't resonate with ARFID. Like, I've done extensive research on all the eating disorders out there, and I'm like, nope, none of this is it. So yeah, to answer your question.
Oh my gosh. No, I love that. I actually didn't know where the label free came
Yeah.
from. And when you describe it, it's like, that makes so much sense.
Mhm.
And I was curious. I actually didn't know. And it's interesting. I was like, this is interesting. It bothered me. I couldn't put you in a box. I didn't know, like, does Liv identify as, like, was anorexia a misdiagnosis? Was it? So that's so interesting. And I cannot wait to read that book, because that makes so much sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay. So you don't personally identify with the ARFID label, but I imagine you resonate with some of the experiences.
Yes.
Do you want to
yes.
do you want to walk us through the 3 types? I know you and I just made an infographic on it.
Yeah. And I know
recently.
actually that the whole label thing came up during the infographic when you were like, maybe this is like a different flavor of anorexia. I remember you called it, and I loved that. But that's kind of how this upcoming book will be about, like all these different like eating adaptations, because that's what I ultimately believe an eating disorder is, like, and diving into ARFID here especially, because first of all, we can start with like fear-based ARFID is one of the subtypes. And this is, having significant fear of negative consequences associated with eating. So maybe choking, vomiting, experiencing GI issues, which I think like every autistic person can pretty much attest to. And this just like this overwhelming fear of these aversive consequences can cause avoidance of certain foods or food groups, which I mean can lead to a very limited diet. And I think a lot of the time, just taking this subtype of ARFID as an example, it's seen as they're so picky or like they're problematic. But I'm like, if they've had like negative traumatic experiences with food in the past, like for them to now have fear around eating, like that's an adaptation. Like that is only like a normal biological response to a certain event. And I think when we can see all eating disorders in this light as like someone's adapted their behavior, whether it be, to fit in a smaller body because they've been conditioned to believe that's socially acceptable. This is an adaptation. And again, like seeing this perspective, having this perspective invites compassion and opens the doors to empower the individual to adapt further, to live a life in which they're free. So I'm gonna just take a drink of water.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love how you frame that. And I think this gets missed unless you're coming at it from a neurodivergent affirming lens, that the fear, I think, can get interpreted as like irrational, but the fear is actually quite rational because for a lot of us, like there's a lot of reasons a person might have, like you're mentioning, because of GI stuff, or like with dyspraxia, like swallowing challenges. And that experience, I mean, thinking about the sensory experience of vomiting, like for anyone that's unpleasant, but for someone with sensory sensitivities. So like, yes, I love how you're framing it as this is, it's not necessarily an irrational response to their past food trauma experiences.
Yeah, I mean, even the term irrational fear, I'm like, fear, we cannot even begin to call fear rational or irrational because it takes place in our brain
The
stem.
irrational brain.
So how can we say it's rational or irrational? Like that's like
That is
saying,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
I like to talk about proportion, because this is where I do have some content around like, so anxiety is not in and of itself disordered, but anxiety disorders do exist. And it's when the proportion gets off. And I think proportional anxiety, proportional fear, like stressor to stress response, I find that language helpful. But you're right, like rationality, like the amygdala is not a rational like part of our brain.
Like,
so
and we could argue that like anytime you have fear, it's a rational response because your body is like unconsciously responding to the situation, which the body does not act without reason, which by definition means it's always rational. But anyways, again, semantics. But speaking of like vomiting and just the sensory, the second subtype of ARFID that we can talk about is sensory-based ARFID. And I think it's important to recognize that like these three subtypes do not exist like by themselves. Like there's a lot of overlap. Like someone can have sensory, fear, and more components, like, and it can all overlap. So again, it's just why I hate the boxes, because it's like, well, what if I also have this and that? It's like, which box do I fit in? But anyways, sensory-based ARFID is typically categorized as, having very strong aversions to textures, tastes, colors, smells of foods, basically all the sensory aspects of food and cooking and meal times, is just, they are more aversive to this, I guess. And people with sensory-based ARFID can just find it really challenging to tolerate, a variety of foods and a variety of textures and colors, because it can be really overwhelming. Like even just if you think about having like 5 different colors of food on a plate, it's like, whoa, like this is way too much going on visually for me. And it's like, okay, I'm just going to eat my peanut butter sandwich because this is brown and this is brown and it's the same color and I can take it in and it's always going to be the same brand because I always know what I'm going to get and it's predictable. And again, it's seen as picky eating, but it's like, if you're doing this to regulate yourself and to reduce your overstimulation, again, you have adapted. your choices are a reflection of having adapted. And then the third type of ARFID is called lack of interest ARFID. And this involves, just generally not being interested in food, not having any motivation to eat, which obviously if you feel no dopamine from eating, like, why would you eat? So yeah, again, people with just, lack of interest ARFID may not experience the feel or the sensory components of the other ARFID types mentioned. But they just may simply not want to eat or not have an appetite. And then there's also ARFID plus, which Megan, do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so ARFID plus is essentially when you don't fit neatly into a category and you've got elements of all of them, which I think a lot of people with ARFID have aspects of all of them. It's interesting. In my household, I do have one child with sensory dominant ARFID, and then another child with no interest dominant ARFID.
Oh.
But I definitely see elements of both. But so I have found the framework helpful because it's like I can understand what's happening. The one about sensory I'll add is, I mean, eating is just such a high sensory experience that I see this with kids a lot. Like if your child is going to in-person school and they're not eating at school, that makes a lot of sense.
Totally.
Because like you're so overstimulated. I remember when I was like working in public spaces, I often want to eat during the day. And I just thought my appetite went away, but it's such a high sensory experience. And people often, I think, don't make that connection necessarily, that if someone's sensory demands, even if it's not food related, are going up in other ways, their ability to eat is going to go way down. So during like life transitions, during just high sensory seasons, that's a time where especially that sensory ARFID is going to bump up quite a bit. I know for me, I don't identify as having ARFID, but even during big life transitions, I rely on my safe foods. Like I'll start eating the same meal like 2 or 3 times a day because I'm just, that's how I'm taking care of my sensory system.
Totally. And before you asked, if I identified as having ARFID, and then I said no, and then you said like, do you sure you identify with components? And I definitely do with the sensory piece. Like and just eating around others, and eating with other people. I cannot eat in front of other people. I cannot eat in social settings. If I ever want like takeout or something, I will always bring it home to me and eat it by myself. Cannot eat at restaurants. Even if I'm like with family or people I feel safe around, can't eat in public. And I think, part of this is the sensory piece, but I think a lot of it is also just trauma from treatment. Because I was watched like a hawk for nearly 10 years, making sure that I ate my food and didn't hide it in my pockets and stuff. And again, my autonomy was taken away, which now, I really don't feel comfortable having people look at me when I eat because I feel like they're watching me. But I feel like it's also an autistic thing of not wanting to be perceived. I feel like that's a huge component too. So I just also wanted to throw that out there in case anyone resonates with that.
Yes, I'm sure many do. I hear that a lot. They're like both not liking being perceived, and I resonate with that, but especially while eating, like that is a very like common experience I hear of. Yeah. Well, Liv, where can people find you and find your work? I'm sure there'll be many people who want to learn more about what you do. So where can people connect with you?
Yeah, so I have my own podcast, the Live Label Free podcast, and that's LIV because I love plays on words. And then my website is where they can find everything regarding my books, my coaching, my courses. I have a free audio training for autistic people called 3 Steps to Recovery from an Eating Disorder as an Autistic Person. And everything they can just find on my website, livelabelfree.com. And yeah, I mean, that should, if they want to get in touch with me, they can there. And that's pretty much everything.
Thank you for that. And thanks for coming on and sharing your story. And it was a really good conversation. I think a lot of good takeaways. We'll have all your information in the show notes too, so that everyone has easy access to everything you just listed. I think that's our awkward goodbye time. So
yeah, I always say thanks so much for listening. Goodbye, everyone.
we make it up as we go. But to everyone listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast, new episodes are out on Fridays on all major platforms and YouTube. Like, download, subscribe, and share. Goodbye.